Welcome back to Biology 2225L AMP2 Lab at CNM. Today's topic, or this week's topic, is the endocrine system. And in your books, in your e-books, this is chapter 17. So the endocrine system has a lot of functions similar to the nervous system. And this is why it's actually chapter 17 in your books, because it does follow logically after the nervous system, which are the chapters right before that. For whatever reason, we continue to follow a more traditional approach of putting endocrine system in AMP2, but an argument could be made for placing it in AMP1 because of the similarities. What are these similarities? Essentially, as you see here, both systems specialize in communication throughout the body and coordination of response. They both use chemicals to carry the messages. Ultimately, the endocrine system, of course, uses chemicals called hormones, which are regulatory molecules released into the bloodstream. The nervous system, of course, uses neurotransmitters, which diffuse across synaptic clefts. Recall that in terms of communication, the body has 4 ways of communicating between cells. Gap junctions that we observed in structures like certain kinds of smooth muscle and cardiac muscle tissue, where materials can move directly cell to cell. Neurotransmitters, again, which convey messages at synapses. A kind of chemical called paracrines, which you probably have not heard that term before. A paracrine is a local regulatory chemical that is secreted not into the blood, but directly into tissue fluids. And the chemical then diffuses through interstitial fluids to nearby cells, having an effect on those nearby cells. We have seen some examples of paracrines, though we didn't use that term to refer to them as paracrines. So some of the chemicals, for instance, involved in blood clotting and released by the endothelial cells to prevent blood clotting are examples of paracrines. And then finally, the topic for today, of course, would be hormones, chemical messengers that are released into the bloodstream. So the endocrine system then consists of all the glands and tissues that secrete these hormones. Endocrine glands are organs, so they do consist of more than one tissue type. And what we're going to review today are what are called the major endocrine glands, meaning organs who have as a major component of their function the release of hormones. There are several organs that release hormones that we are not going to look at today because they have as their major function some other function. An example of that, for instance, would be the heart, which we know its major function is to pump blood through the body, but it does, as we'll see, release a hormone. So at the very end, near the end of this presentation, I'm just going to mention some of the other organs of the body that you may not be aware also release some hormones. And again, a hormone is by definition a chemical messenger that is transported by the bloodstream and has some kind of effect on a target organ. Again, very similar to a neurotransmitter, a chemical that has an effect on a target organ, but of course in this case it's delivered by blood, not action potentials and then neurotransmitters at synapses. The endocrine system is perhaps the most anatomically simple system that we cover. In terms of just the gross anatomy of it, we really just have a relatively few organs in the system. The pineal gland, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland, all structures that you may recall from AMP1 when we studied the brain. These are all part of the endocrine system. The thyroid gland up near the larynx. The thymus sitting just under the sternum. Down in the abdominal cavity, we have the adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidneys, and we have the pancreas, of course, which we learned when we did the digestive system. And then finally we have the gonads, ovaries in females, testes in males. We'll touch on the gonads this week, but we're really going to focus on them more in the next 2 weeks when we finish up the term with male and female reproductive systems. Recall that endocrine glands and exocrine glands are distinct. Exocrine glands, remember, are glands that have secretions carried to some surface through a duct. And so these would be things like digestive enzymes, sweat, saliva. Anytime the secretion is released onto a surface through a duct, that's an exocrine gland. Those are very different from what we're talking about today, which are endocrine glands. Endocrine glands have no ducts. They simply release their secretions directly across capillary walls into the bloodstream. And then at the very bottom of this particular slide, you see liver cells are kind of tough to describe because they do a little bit of everything. They do release some hormones, though they are not considered a major endocrine gland. But as we know, they also release bile and bicarbonate through a duct system. So the liver and also the pancreas has dual function, though in the pancreas it's distinct cells that perform the functions. For instance, remember, acinar cells are the cells that are exocrine in nature, and islet of Langerhans cells are the cells that are endocrine in nature. So the pancreas isn't quite like the liver because we can identify actually different cell types that do these different functions. But in the liver, it's all the same cell, hepatocytes. That one kind of cell can do both kinds of functions, both endocrine and exocrine. Again, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the nervous and endocrine systems are very similar to one another. There's some thinking that the nervous system may have evolved out of a primitive endocrine system or an ancestral endocrine system. The similarities are, again, both systems serve for communication, right? So they both respond to stimuli, hopefully in an appropriate way, and create a response that helps adjust to that change or stimulus. They are a little bit different in terms of how quick the response is. The nervous system reacts quickly because, of course, it uses action potentials to travel most of the distance between cells. The endocrine system, of course, is a slower response because it takes time for hormones to be distributed by the bloodstream to their target organs. Also, remember that the nervous system is quicker because it's a very targeted response. We send messages to a very specific effector organ through neural pathways. The endocrine response is very general because the hormones spread throughout the entire body via the bloodstream. We don't have an ability to specifically send a hormone to one target organ. So that does slow down the response a little bit, but it also tends to make the endocrine response a little more widespread in general than the nervous system, which is very specific and very targeted. In terms of adaptation, and what we mean by this really, again, is acclimatization, adjustment. The nervous system acclimatizes very quickly. It happens, it responds, and then the response can stop just as quickly. The endocrine system acclimatizes very slowly. While the response is slow to get going, it tends to persist, and it is not something that we tend to be able to shut off or stop on a dime. So those are some similarities, but also some differences in terms of how the endocrine system and the nervous system create internal communication for us. Now, in terms of the chemicals of the two systems, of course, again, we've contrasted them as neurotransmitters and hormones. I think it's interesting to point out that there are some molecules that serve both functions. So norepinephrine, dopamine, we tend to think of those as neurotransmitters, but both can function as hormones. Antidiuretic hormone we tend to think of as a hormone, of course, by virtue of the name, but it also can function as a neurotransmitter in the brain. And also, both systems can have similar effects. because the neurotransmitter norepinephrine and the hormone glucagon, for instance, both cause similar effects on the liver. So it's not uncommon for a neurotransmitter and a hormone to have similar effects on a target tissue. There is some interplay between the two systems. As we'll see, there are some cases where the nervous system can affect gland function, and there are some cases where hormones can affect the nervous system function. So there is an interplay between the two. And then there are some cells known as neuroendocrine cells, which are interesting. These are found primarily in the hypothalamus. And neuroendocrine cells are interesting in that they're neurons. This says neuron-like cells. For all intents and purposes, they're neurons. But at their axon terminals, instead of secreting a neurotransmitter into a synapse, they secrete a hormone into the bloodstream. And the two kinds of neuroendocrine cells that we'll talk about are the cells that release oxytocin into the blood, and the cells that release, again, anti-diuretic hormone. These actually come from axon terminals of these neuron-like cells. And again, as is typical with the nervous system, the end target or effector of the neural pathway has to have receptors for the neurotransmitter, and the same is true for the endocrine system. The target organ of the hormone can only respond to the hormone if that target organ has receptors on its cells for that specific hormone. So here we see a visual, again, just summarizing the similarities and differences between the two systems. Again, in both cases, we're releasing a chemical onto some target cells, but in one case it's via a synapse, in the other case it's via the bloodstream. And again, in terms of the transmission of the signal over long distances, it's done by action potentials in the nervous system, and of course done by the bloodstream in the endocrine system. Excuse me. All right, so let's start talking about the anatomy of the system. And as we go through this system, I'll also be talking about the histology where appropriate. So there is going to be a second video to accompany this video of the models, as is usual, but that's going to be a very short video because, again, anatomically the system is very simple. The histology of the system will just embed into this particular PowerPoint video, because the PowerPoint from the book shows the histology very nicely, and it's very similar to the slides we would have looked at in the lab. So we have to start any discussion of the endocrine system with the hypothalamus. Now, we learn the hypothalamus as a structure of the brain. Remember, it's a funnel-shaped, basically it's the funnel-shaped floor of the third ventricle located in the diencephalon of the brain. So it's very centrally located. And you may recall from AMP1 that the hypothalamus has a variety of important functions. It is a control center for the autonomic nervous system. It is a seat of thirst, seat of hunger, seat of sex drive, seat of aggression. It's the body's thermostat regulating body temperature, and so on and so on and so forth. So many, many very important basic functions carried out by the hypothalamus. What we don't emphasize as much in AMP1 is the relationship that the hypothalamus has to the pituitary gland. In addition to all the other things that the hypothalamus does, it also is very much a regulator of pituitary function. So recall, the pituitary gland is suspended off the bottom of the hypothalamus by a structure known as the infundibulum. So the hypothalamus tapers down to an infundibulum, and then the pituitary gland dangles from the end of the infundibulum. And again, just to review some AMP1 lab material, the pituitary gland, recall, sits in a depression in the floor of the skull called the sella turcica, Latin for Turkish saddle. And so it is well protected by the sphenoid bone in the floor of the cranium. Excuse me. The pituitary gland, which is, by the way, also known as the hypophysis, is split up into two portions which are actually very distinct from one another. These two portions are known as the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, also known as the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis. Again, hypophysis is another name for the pituitary gland. And I like this distinction between adeno and neurohypophysis because it highlights one of the main differences between the two structures. Of course, anterior and posterior also highlight a difference. The anterior pituitary is the front part of the pituitary, and of course the posterior pituitary is the back part. But what adeno and neurohypophysis emphasize is the different kinds of tissue that make up these portions of the pituitary gland. Adeno is a word that means glandular. Neuro, of course, is a word that means neural, or having to do with neurons. And that's exactly what we see when we look at these two portions of the pituitary gland under the microscope. The adenohypophysis, or anterior pituitary, is made of truly glandular tissue. The cells that make it up are endocrine gland type cells that produce its hormones. The neurohypophysis, on the other hand, is made up of neural tissue, neurons. And so remember, we said earlier that there are some cells that sort of are intermediate between endocrine and neural cells. Well, those are some of the kinds of cells you're seeing in the neurohypophysis, or the posterior pituitary. And so the hormones made by the posterior pituitary actually don't derive from typical glandular cells. They actually are derived from neural tissue. And we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. All right, so starting with the adenohypophysis, the anterior pituitary gland, this makes up most of the pituitary, and it is linked to the hypothalamus by a portal circuit, a portal circulation. Remember, a portal circulation is one in which you have two capillary beds in sequence instead of just instead of just a single capillary bed. We saw that there was a portal system in the kidneys between glomerulus and peritubular capillaries. We spent some time looking at the hepatic portal system between digestive organs and the liver. And here we see our third and final portal system in the body, the hypophyseal portal system. And so essentially what happens is the hypothalamus has the first capillary bed surrounding it, and the hypothalamus actually releases some hormones into the first capillary bed. And then the capillary bed is drained into a venule, and that venule travels the very short distance down the infundibulum to a second capillary bed that surrounds the adenohypophysis. And the reason we have this portal circuit is so that the hormones released by the hypothalamus can travel that short distance down to the anterior pituitary and be delivered into the anterior pituitary at the second capillary bed. That second capillary bed, of course, then also functions to pick up hormones released by the anterior pituitary and then carry those on to the rest of the body. So what kind of hormones are released by the hypothalamus? Well, once again, there are hormones that are released by neural tissue. So again, these intermediate kinds of cells that are actually neurons releasing hormones instead of neurotransmitters. And there are actually quite a few different hormones released by the hypothalamus, but we don't list those on our list of terms. So I make note of them, but you're not responsible for knowing their particular names. In general, I think it's helpful for you to understand that these are generally referred to as releasing and inhibiting hormones. Releasing hormones are hormones that are going to travel to the adenohypophysis and stimulate it to release its hormones, or specific ones of its hormones. Inhibiting hormones, on the other hand, are hormones that are going to obviously inhibit the activity of the anterior pituitary in terms of releasing some of its particular hormones. So here we see a diagram of this relationship between the hypothalamus, this funnel-shaped region again up here, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. The shaded region is the anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis. This lighter colored region is, of course, the posterior pituitary. Here we see the portal system. In red, we see the first capillary bed, which is going to pick up hormones in the hypothalamus, as I described. Notice again that these hormones are being produced by neurons, not typical endocrine cells. And so conventionally we might call them neurotransmitters, but in this case we have to call them hormones. They travel down these short connecting venules, down the infundibulum, the stalk-like structure, to the second capillary bed again around the anterior pituitary gland. And these hormones, again, if you look at their names, they're all releasing and inhibiting hormones. Releasing hormones, again, notice the specificity. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, for instance, is going to be a hormone that specifically stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormone, one of its hormones, which is called thyrotropin. Prolactin inhibiting hormone is going to have a very specific function when it arrives at the anterior pituitary. In this case, it's going to inhibit the release of one of the anterior pituitary's hormones, in this case prolactin. So these releasing and inhibiting hormones are very specific in their function. And then again, of course, and we'll go through these in order, the anterior pituitary, of course, has its own slew of hormones that it releases. One thing I want to say about the anterior pituitary hormones is that many of them are hormones that will affect the behavior of other glands in the body, other endocrine glands in the body. So follicle stimulating hormone, that's going to stimulate testes and ovaries. Luteinizing hormone is going to have an effect on the activity of, again, testes and ovaries. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to affect the behavior of the thyroid gland. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to affect the behavior of the adrenal cortex and of the adrenal gland. So most of the anterior pituitary's hormones are what we call tropic hormones. Tropic hormones. And when you see that word tropic or tropin, what you want to think is that is a hormone, a tropic hormone. That's a hormone that is going to stimulate the behavior of another gland. So we've got the releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus that are affecting the behavior of the anterior pituitary. And then the anterior pituitary, by releasing tropic type hormones, are going to affect the behavior of other glands in the body. So we have this nested system of control, essentially, where the hypothalamus tends to control the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary then goes on to control several other endocrine organs. This is why some people refer to the anterior pituitary as the master gland of the body. I'm not sure I care very much for that nomenclature because it doesn't affect all the glands of the body, but as you see, it does affect several of them. As we said, the neurohypophysis is a distinct structure made of nerve tissue instead of glandular tissue. And so your book says it's not a true gland. Well, in that regard, it's not a true gland, but in every other way, it functions as an endocrine gland because, again, it does release controlling chemicals that are secreted into the bloodstream and affect distant organs. There is no involvement of the portal system with the neurohypophysis. We don't need it because, again, we're not trying to stimulate glandular cells. Essentially, the neurohypophysis is really just an extension of the hypothalamus. And so what we see is we have neurons in the hypothalamus, or at least neurons whose soma or cell bodies are in the hypothalamus, and their axons. The axons of those individual cells will pass down through the infundibulum and terminate in the posterior pituitary. And so at the tips of those axons, of course, that's where we conventionally will release neurotransmitters. But in this case, again, the neurotransmitters are going to function as hormones. And those secretions from the axons are stored in the neurohypophysis until stimulated to release them into the capillary bed surrounding it, and so again functioning as hormone. So here we see the relationship between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary that I just described. Again, funnel-shaped hypothalamus leading to the infundibulum. In this case, notice no portal circulation. Instead, we have neuron cell bodies up here in the hypothalamus, and again, these are in very specific locations. We don't need to know the names, but paraventricular nucleus for one, supraoptic nucleus for the other. And notice their axons are traveling down the infundibulum. The axon terminals, again, then release their neurotransmitter / hormone, and that is stored in the neurohypophysis until it's time to release them. The two hormones produced by the posterior pituitary gland are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Here we see on a cadaver the appearance of the hypothalamus, again this funnel-shaped region right here, stalk-like infundibulum, which leads to the pituitary, which is nestled in that sella turcica, nicely protected again by the sphenoid bone. Here we see the histology of the pituitary gland, and it's really quite distinctive under the microscope, and what's distinctive about it again is this juxtaposition, this very close juxtaposition of classic neural tissue with glial cells and axons and so on, and classic glandular tissue sitting side by side. So whenever you see neural tissue and glandular tissue side by side, that's pretty much a giveaway that you're looking at the pituitary gland. As I said, the hypothalamus produces several releasing and inhibiting hormones. But again, we're not responsible for them, so they are listed here in the PowerPoint, but we're not going to cover those in this particular lab. Now, recall that the neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary, does release two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Technically, these are hypothalamic hormones, even though because they're actually manufactured by the neurons whose cell bodies are up in the hypothalamus. So they're released by the posterior pituitary, but they're manufactured in the hypothalamus. So technically, we have to consider them hypothalamic hormones, even though they're released and stored by the posterior pituitary. And again, here's another picture of the pituitary gland, again highlighting the distinction between glandular tissue in the anterior pituitary and neural tissue in the posterior pituitary. All right, so let's look at these hormones associated with the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary. It releases several different hormones, which you see listed on our list of terms. The first two are kind of functionally linked together. They're called follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These names reflect their activity or effect on the ovaries, but they also affect the testes as well. But for whatever reason, we choose to name them based on their effect on the ovaries. Follicle-stimulating hormone tends to be a hormone that promotes the development or maturation of the what are called follicles in the ovaries. As we'll learn when we do the female reproductive system, the ovaries are full of what we call primordial follicles that have to be stimulated to develop into mature follicles, which then release the ovum, the egg cell. And so follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the development of these follicles and the development of the egg inside. By analogy, in the male, of course, the follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates sperm production within the seminiferous tubules of the testes. Okay, and in both cases, follicle-stimulating hormone will also secrete or stimulate um, um, some sex hormone production. It's especially potent in females in stimulating the release of ovarian sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. Luteinizing hormone, on the other hand, has again also affects the gonads, but it affects it in different ways. Luteinizing hormone, for instance, stimulates the actual event of ovulation. So this is the hormone that spikes during the time of ovulation. And following ovulation, luteinizing hormone will stimulate the follicle that just ovulated an egg to turn into something called the corpus luteum, which is a body that secretes progesterone. Now, again, we're going to talk much more about this when we get to the female reproductive system, but essentially, by stimulating the creation of the corpus luteum, this is what maintains pregnancy. As long as the corpus luteum exists and is secreting progesterone, this will maintain pregnancy. If pregnancy doesn't occur following ovulation, then there are some hormonal feedback signals that will cause luteinizing hormone levels to decrease, which will cause progesterone levels to decrease, and instead of pregnancy, menstruation will follow. But again, we're going to talk much more about that in a couple of weeks. And then again, also luteinizing hormone also has an effect on males. Its primary effect in males is to stimulate the secretion of testosterone from what are called interstitial cells in the testes. So two of its hormones clearly have regulatory effects on the gonads. Another tropic hormone, again a hormone that affects another gland, is thyroid stimulating hormone, also known as thyrotropin. And of course, thyroid stimulating hormone is a hormone that stimulates activity of the thyroid gland and the release of thyroid hormone. A fourth hormone of the anterior pituitary is called adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is a mouthful, but again is trying to tell us something. It's a tropic hormone, so it's going to affect another gland. What other gland is it going to affect? Well, it's going to affect the adrenal gland. Now, when we get to the adrenal gland, we'll see that the adrenal gland has two parts to it, a cortex and a medulla. This hormone specifically affects the cortex of the adrenal gland, not the medulla, not the core, just the outer cortex. So, put it all together, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And so the name tells you exactly what it does. It stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete its hormones, which we will talk about again in a few minutes. Fifth hormone produced by the anterior pituitary is prolactin. Prolactin, as the name implies again, promotes lactation. So after childbirth, this is the hormone that stimulates the mammary glands to manufacture milk. It does not stimulate the release of milk during suckling. That's going to be a different hormone. Prolactin stimulates the production of milk by the mammary glands. And then finally, on our list, we have growth hormone, the sixth major hormone produced by the anterior pituitary. And growth hormone has a variety of effects throughout the body, very complex in its function. And it works primarily through the liver. But to make a long story short, we'll just say that the growth hormone stimulates mitosis and cell differentiation. It also stimulates metabolic activity, just generally has a stimulatory effect on the metabolic behavior of cells and promotes mitosis and therefore growth and repair of tissues and so on. And so that's growth hormone. Again, here we see the different hormones that we just talked about and their target organs. As I said, most of growth hormones' effects are mediated through the liver, but that's beyond the scope of our lab. In lecture, you may talk more about how growth hormone works through the liver. Now again, the posterior pituitary releases two hormones, but again, these are more technically considered to be hypothalamic hormones. But again, they are released by the posterior pituitary. And these two hormones, once again, are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone we've already talked about when we talked about the urinary system. Remember, antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that promotes the reabsorption of water by the kidneys. So the more antidiuretic hormone you have, the more water you reabsorb from the filtrate back into the bloodstream. So this reduces the urine volume. All right, so its immediate effect is to prevent dehydration, but it also has secondary effects. By reducing urine volume, what that means is you're going to increase blood volume. And when you increase blood volume, as we know, that causes an increase in blood pressure. So it's a hormone that doesn't just affect your hydration status, it also affects blood pressure. At particularly high concentrations, it also has a vasoconstrictive effect. It can also act as a vasoconstrictor, which of course also will increase blood pressure. This leads to its second name that some people use for it, which is vasopressin, which means vessel pressure, right? So vasoconstriction, increasing blood pressure. Deficiencies in antidiuretic hormone will result in excessive urination, which of course does result in dehydration and plummeting blood pressure. And individuals with this condition are said to have diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus. This is not, again, diabetes mellitus that we associate with insulin. It has nothing to do with sugar. It is just excessive urination and dehydration associated with a deficit in antidiuretic hormone. Both conditions are called diabetes because the word diabetes means to flow through like a sieve. What that means is both conditions are characterized by excessive urination. However, in one case, that the urine will contain glucose. That's the one associated with insulin. And in the other case, there is no glucose in the urine. And in fact, the two terms, diabetes insipidus and diabetes mellitus, reflect this presence of sugar in the urine for one of them and not the other, because mellitus means sweet, honey-like or sweet. So diabetes mellitus has to do with sugar in the urine. Insipid means tasteless. And so diabetes insipidus doesn't have any sweetness in the urine. And don't ask me to talk about who was doing the tasting back in the day to distinguish these two conditions. Oxytocin, the second hormone released by the posterior pituitary, but again made by the hypothalamus, is also known as Pitocin. Pitocin technically is the synthetic version of oxytocin, and of course we're familiar with Pitocin because many women have been administered Pitocin to assist during labor and delivery. And so what we know about it is that it is stimulated during sexual arousal and emotional feelings and bonding. So some people refer to it as the cuddle hormone. Because it is released during emotional and physical bonding between partners. In terms of its function, and again, some people are still debating its role in pair bonding and the emotions associated with relationships and so on. In terms of its physical functions, we know that it stimulates labor contractions, and so this is why Pitocin is administered to help labor in some cases. And oxytocin is also the hormone that stimulates the release of milk during lactation. So again, prolactin stimulates the manufacturing of milk, but it's oxytocin in response to suckling that causes milk to be released during lactation. And again, because of its role in potentially emotional bonding, we believe that lactation and breastfeeding helps strengthen the emotional bonding between mother and infant in a similar fashion because of this surge of oxytocin associated with breastfeeding. All right. In terms of control of secretion, we really don't have time to go into this for each gland on our list of terms. Again, something we'll talk about more in lecture usually. But I just want to point out that in general, control of hormone secretion can be done at a couple of different levels. You can regulate glands via the nervous system. Sometimes it's an automatic kind of release of a neurotransmitter or hormone from the nervous system. Sometimes it's in response to chemical changes in the body. Sometimes it's in response perhaps to emotional or conscious stimuli. So the only message here is that there are a variety of stimuli that can be used potentially to regulate the activity of a particular gland, and it's going to be slightly different for different glands in the body. Negative feedback is an important mechanism of control as well. So in many cases, it's simply a negative feedback loop where as hormone levels in the blood rise, the levels of that hormone end up inhibiting its own production so that we maintain a homeostatic level of that hormone. And again, so there are a variety of different mechanisms, but we're not going to be specific about which mechanisms control which hormone. That's, again, a lecture topic. Positive feedback can occur sometimes. Remember, positive feedback is the snowball effect, and it's pretty rare as a homeostatic mechanism, but you do see it in some cases. For instance, the stretching of the uterus will increase oxytocin release, which causes contraction, which places more stress in the wall of the uterus, which causes more oxytocin to be released, and you have this sort of snowball effect of increasing contraction strength until, of course, the baby is delivered. Remember, positive feedback mechanisms can't persist continually or indefinitely because, again, they will just get out of control. Eventually, they have to be terminated. Okay, the next organ we're going to talk about in the PowerPoint is the pineal gland. This comes a little bit later in our list of terms. It's actually the last organ on our list of terms, but we're going to talk about it now because it's here in the PowerPoint. Pineal gland, again, remember from A&P1, is a brain structure. It exists in the epithalamus of the diencephalon, so it forms pretty much the posterior roof of the third ventricle. It is a gland that tends to diminish in size as we age, so it's particularly large in, or not large, but it is large up until about age 7, and then it diminishes by the time you get to an adult. It doesn't stop functioning, it just reduces its size and functions a bit as we become adults. It's not terribly well understood how and what the pineal gland does. We know it releases a hormone called melatonin, which is manufactured primarily during the night, during the night hours, meaning not necessarily during sleep, but during darkness. So this is a gland that definitely is affected by how much light we're exposed to. And the effect of melatonin seems to be to help us coordinate or regulate our basic biorhythms. Certainly our daily rhythms, but perhaps some other rhythms as well, such as menstrual cycles or even annual patterns of metabolism or even mood. So to make a long story short, humans have an internal clock that is not quite perfectly 24 hours. And so if we are not exposed to sunlight to reset that clock, we would gradually become out of synchrony with the time around us or the day around us. And that would result in things like we would start to get sleepy perhaps at 3 in the afternoon instead of during the evening. But fortunately that doesn't happen because the pineal gland is constantly, through its manufacturing of melatonin, somehow resetting our clock and synchronizing it with the day around us. Of course, day length affects how much light and dark we're exposed to, and some people get fairly depressed as the day length changes with seasons. Usually this happens as we get reduced light and longer nights in the wintertime. And this is often referred to as seasonal affective disorder, abbreviated as SAD. And again, it's depression associated with shorter day lengths in either wintertime or sometimes you see it in people moving to higher latitudes, more northern climates, like somewhere in Alaska, for instance. And this can be a significant kind of depression that people suffer, and it seems to have something to do with biorhythms associated with the pineal gland. And here again, the pineal gland nestled up in its location in the epithalamus and the backside of the diencephalon. It's called pineal gland because it literally looks like a little pine cone on that backside of the diencephalon. And here we see some things that I just talked about. Again, synthesizing melatonin at night, seasonal affective disorder, creating depression and irritability. And again, you need exposure to light each day to help reset that biological clock. All right, the thymus is another gland that diminishes with age. And the thymus is an interesting gland. It tends to be included in 3 separate systems: the endocrine system, the lymphatic system, so we already have mentioned it this semester, and the immune system, which, while not an organ system, is a functional system of the body. It's a bilobed gland that sits in the mediastinum. Remember, the mediastinum is that area between the lungs, and it sits above the heart, and essentially sits just beneath the sternum. And like the pineal gland, it diminishes in size after puberty, and by the time you become elderly, from what I understand, it really is just a mass of connective tissue by that time. But while it's functional, it is important in the immune system because it is the place where undifferentiated lymphocytes go to become T cells. And T cells are a kind of lymphocyte, a T lymphocyte, and they're called T cells because of this need to mature in the thymus of the body. To promote this differentiation, the thymus releases several hormones: thymopoietin, thymosin, thymulin. These are all hormones that stimulate immature lymphocytes to become T cells. T cells, to make a long story short, are important in cell-mediated immunity, which means T cells are the cells of your immune system that will attack human cells that are abnormal. And so T cells are responsible for attacking, for instance, damaged human cells that are damaged by trauma, virally infected human cells, and perhaps most notably cancer cells that might become established in the body. So these are very important. This is a very important part of our immune response. T cells are also the cells that are important in tissue rejection. So if you receive an organ transplant, it's the T cells that will recognize if those tissues aren't matched up appropriately, that those are foreign human cells, and will attack those as well. One quick last thing about T cells to remind you is that a certain population of T cells are referred to as helper T cells. These don't directly attack things themselves, but they produce a slew of regulatory chemicals that essentially regulate and control the behavior of all the other T cells and even the B cells that are releasing antibodies. And so really your entire immune response depends on the appropriate functioning of this class of T cells called helper T cells. Without them, the immune system essentially fails. This is important because there is a virus the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, that specifically targets helper T cells in the body, and by doing so, pretty much causes immunodeficiency. And so AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, is the result of HIV infection, which attacks helper T cells specifically. And individuals with AIDS then, of course, cannot fight off opportunistic infections, things that the rest of us might brush off. And so the cause of death isn't usually AIDS. The cause of death would be something like pneumonia or some other opportunistic infection. This is particularly appropriate during the current time where we're dealing with COVID-19. And of course, people who are HIV positive have to be very careful because they are very much at risk from a virus like COVID-19. These hormones produced by the thymus also, of course, affect other lymphatic organs and help promote their development as well. So again, they're hormones, so they're this is part of the endocrine system that affects the development of other lymphatic organs, so part of the lymphatic system, and of course, by virtue of being the site of T cell maturation, they are involved in the this is involved in the immune system as well. And here again we see the location of the thymus between the lungs above the heart, very large in a newborn, much reduced in an adult. And here we see actual cadaver photos of the thymus in newborn on the right and adult on the left. Okay, and we come to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is the largest gland in the body that's solely endocrine. The pancreas is larger, but remember, the pancreas also is an exocrine gland as well. The thyroid gland consists of two lobes that sit on either side of the trachea below the larynx, so it's up in your throat. And histologically, it's a very distinctive organ. It consists of hollow sacs called follicles, and these are known as thyroid follicles. And these follicles are usually filled with a very thick, viscous, protein-rich substance known as thyroglobulin. So the follicles, the thyroid, these big sac-like structures are filled with a material known as thyroglobulin. The cells that align the follicles are very characteristic, simple cuboidal epithelium, and these are the cells that are ultimately making this thyroglobulin. Essentially what happens is these follicular cells secrete thyroxine and triiodothyronine. These are the two forms of thyroid hormone. And the important thing to appreciate without going too much into the biochemistry of it is that in both cases, what's essential to producing thyroid hormone is iodine. Thyroxine contains 4 iodine atoms. Triiodothyronine contains 3 iodine atoms. Now, most thyroid hormone is thyroxine. Most of it is the version that has 4 iodine atoms. I mention this because iodine deficiencies, of course, will cause problems with the production of thyroid hormone. Without iodine, you can't make thyroid hormone effectively. And iodine is not something that traditionally is very common in the diet. Traditionally, the main source of iodine for people was seafood. And so what happened when we colonized North America, of course, the original 13 colonies were all bordering the Atlantic, or at least close to the Atlantic, and seafood was plenty. As people started to migrate west away from the Atlantic coast into more landlocked states, dietary acquisition of iodine became more problematic. This forced us at some point to consider how we might get iodine to everybody, even if they didn't eat much seafood. And what was realized very quickly is, well, everybody uses salt, and iodine won't really affect the taste of salt or the behavior of salt. And so we began to iodize salt as a way of getting an adequate iodine supply into everyone's diet. And so that's why when you go to the market, you notice most of your salt is referred to as iodized salt. Okay. Again, making sure to provide us with enough iodine to make thyroid hormone. What does thyroid hormone do? Thyroid hormone is generally a hormone that stimulates metabolism. It generally increases your metabolic rate. And so notice here it says increases metabolic rate, increases your rate of oxygen consumption. So therefore, of course, increases your heat production, affects your appetite, affects the release of growth hormone. Generally speaking, a stimulatory effect on the body. So people with adequate or lots of thyroid hormone, they burn calories pretty quickly. If you're a hypothyroid, meaning you don't make enough thyroid hormone, then your burning of calories at your baseline rate at which you burn calories is going to be reduced, and people who are hypothyroid tend to gain weight easily. Now, thyroid hormone is not the only hormone that the thyroid gland makes. There is a second hormone made by a separate set of cells in the thyroid gland called the parafollicular cells. These are cells that are not lining the follicles, but instead between the follicles, and they secrete the hormone calcitonin. You may remember this hormone from AMP1 when we talked about the skeletal system. Remember, calcitonin is a hormone that stimulates osteoblasts to make more bone tissue and so pulls calcium out of the bloodstream. So ultimately the effect of calcitonin is to promote bone formation and reduce blood calcium levels. Calcitonin, also remember, is most active in children because that's when the skeleton is growing the fastest. In adults, calcitonin doesn't really play too much of a role. It plays a minor role in blood calcium regulation, but it's most important in children when the skeleton is growing at its fastest. Excuse me. Again, for anybody who's more interested in the biochemistry of how we make thyroid hormone, I included this slide just to give you some information. Those interested can pause the presentation here and take a look at what's being said. I've also included a diagram of what's going on in the follicular cells lining the follicles to make thyroid hormone. Essentially what's happening is, as I mentioned earlier, they make this large protein called thyroglobulin, and attached to thyroglobulin are two amino acids called tyrosine. So here we see two tyrosine amino acids as part of the big thyroglobulin chain. We pump in iodine from the bloodstream, assuming you have adequate iodine, and these iodines are attached to the tyrosines that are attached to the thyroglobulin. Now, you can either attach a single iodine or or two iodines, creating monoiodinized tyrosine or diiodinized tyrosine. So you either have a 2-iodine version of tyrosine or a 1-iodine version. Eventually then what happens is this thyroglobulin with iodine on it is stored again in the follicles. When it's time to produce the hormone, it gets taken up again by the follicle cell, and the thyroglobulin gets broken down. Specifically, these two tyrosines get pulled off of the thyroglobulin molecule, and they get linked to each other. And so the hormone, the actual thyroid hormone, is just two tyrosine amino acids linked to each other. Now, if we happen to link a tyrosine with 2 iodines with a tyrosine that has 1, we're going to produce triiodothyronine, the version of the hormone that has 3 iodines. If we happen to link a tyrosine that has 2 iodines with another tyrosine that has 2 iodines, we're going to produce the 4-iodine version of the hormone, that's thyroxine. And again, this is the more common version of the hormone. But both will have metabolic effects on their target tissues. Both will generally cause an increase in metabolism. And of course, as is always the case with hormones, they are then released into the bloodstream where they are transported. As it turns out, thyroid hormone is not terribly soluble in blood plasma, and so we generally have transport proteins like albumins in the blood that help transport the hormone. Much more detail probably than you were interested in, but there you go. All right. Here's the thymus. I think this slide is a little bit out of order. We don't actually have any slides of the thymus in lab anyway, so we can ignore this slide. Here's the thyroid gland, which I'm obviously more interested in at this point. Again, showing its location on either side of the trachea, just below the larynx. Cadaver view of the thyroid gland. And then here's the very characteristic histological view of the thyroid gland with the follicles, as we said, the sac-like follicles, the simple cuboidal epithelium surrounding it. That's the follicular cells that make the thyroid hormone. The parafollicular cells are these interstitial cells here, these cells that are not lining the follicles. And those are the masses of cells that will make the calcitonin. Those are the parafollicular cells, again, not lining the follicles. So thyroid hormone comes from the follicular cells lining the follicles, and calcitonin from the parafollicular cells. You can see that these hollow follicles are filled with a viscous substance. This is the thyroglobulin colloid stored in the follicles. Here we have a closer view so you can better, again, make out the simple cuboidal epithelium, that is the follicular cells, and then the masses of parafollicular cells not lining the follicles. And one last look at, again, the same structures. Now, there is also a gland called the parathyroid glands that are embedded within the thyroid glands. Usually there's about 4, but there can be up to 8 little nodules embedded on the back side of the thyroid gland. And these, of course, secrete very nicely a hormone called parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is the main hormone that affects blood calcium levels. And again, you may recall this from A&P1 when you talked about the skeletal system. It has the opposite effect of calcitonin, whereas calcitonin tends to stimulate osteoblasts and pull calcium out of the blood. Parathyroid hormone tends to stimulate osteoclasts and the breakdown of bone tissue to release calcium into the bloodstream. So its net effect is to increase blood calcium levels. It doesn't just do this by stimulating osteoclasts. It also stimulates the synthesis of calcitriol, which, remember, is vitamin D. And vitamin D is necessary, of course, to increase the absorption of dietary calcium. So ultimately, it increases absorption of calcium, which of course will then increase its blood levels. And then finally, parathyroid hormone, remember, decreases how much calcium is lost in the kidneys, decreases the amount of calcium in urine, and all these things combined will help to increase blood calcium levels. And so in adults, this is primarily how we regulate blood calcium levels, by either increasing or decreasing secretion of parathyroid hormone. And again, here we see the little nodules of parathyroid glands on the back side of the thyroid gland. Histologically, the parathyroid gland looks like typical glandular tissue, very much like other glandular tissues. The distinctive feature is you always want to recognize that it's near or juxtaposed to thyroid tissue. Remember, thyroid tissue is very characteristic with its follicles. So if I see a nodule of typical glandular tissues next to what is obviously thyroid gland tissue, then this must be the parathyroid gland. Here we see a close-up of the parathyroid gland, but very difficult to tell what it is if you don't see the surrounding follicle. All right. Next, we have the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, of course, sit on top of the kidneys, and I say of course because that's what adrenal means. Ad means on top of, renal means kidneys. So adrenal tells you they sit on top of the kidneys. So of course we have 2. You may remember earlier that I mentioned that the adrenal glands have 2 layers, an outer layer called the cortex and an inner core known as the medulla. These are very distinct regions producing very different kinds of hormones. So we're going to focus on the cortex. We tend to focus on the cortex first. And when we look at the cortex under the microscope, you see that it is organized very distinctly into three layers. Three layers, right, with different staining properties. The outermost layer is called the zona glomerulosa. Underneath that, we have a lighter zona fasciculata. And then the deepest layer of the cortex is the zona reticularis, where it tends to get dark again. Then below that, of course, would be the adrenal medulla. And so usually you can make out these three distinct layers, and we have different hormones associated with each of those three different layers of the cortex. So here again, a cadaver picture illustrating the location of the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys. A closer view of the adrenal gland sitting on top of a kidney. Another view of the entire adrenal gland under the microscope. And once again, I think you can make out in the cortex here the three zones: glomerulosa, fasciculata, and then deepest reticularis. And then at the core again, the medulla. So the medulla, I guess we will start with the medulla. That's good because that's how our list of terms presents it. The adrenal medulla is the inner part, and it really, as you noticed in the previous histological view, is the only about 20% or so of the entire gland. The adrenal medulla is interesting because it actually has neuron-like cells in it, which pick up signals from the sympathetic nervous system. They receive acetylcholine from sympathetic axons, and in response to that acetylcholine from the sympathetic fibers that it communicates with, it releases the so-called catecholamine hormones. And the catecholamine hormones are epinephrine and norepinephrine. The majority of the adrenal medulla secretions is epinephrine, with only a relatively small percentage being norepinephrine. Remember, norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system at its target tissues. So essentially, again, excuse me, to make a long story short, it takes two neurons to get a sympathetic signal out to a target organ. You have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine. The postganglionic neuron picks that acetylcholine up, travels the rest of the way to the target organ, and then releases norepinephrine onto the target tissue. That's the sympathetic nervous system. What we're seeing here is that you have a preganglionic neuron only that is not stimulating a second sympathetic neuron, but instead stimulating the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla then goes ahead and acts like the second neuron of the sympathetic nervous system, but instead of releasing norepinephrine at a synapse, releases epinephrine and a little norepinephrine as a hormone. So really interesting, again, highlighting the great similarity between endocrine and neural function. The entire adrenal medulla is essentially taking the place of the postganglionic sympathetic neuron, and instead of releasing norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter to a specific target, is releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine as a hormone into the bloodstream. This is a large part of what creates a fight or flight response, this system-wide activation of the sympathetic nervous system, creating a system-wide response to usually a threat or something like exercise. Excuse me. Another name, by the way, for epinephrine and norepinephrine is adrenaline and noradrenaline. These are a little bit older terms, and so this helps us understand and remember, of course, that these are produced by the adrenal gland. That's what the name adrenaline is derived from. And You've heard, no doubt, of an adrenaline surge or adrenaline junkies, people who enjoy the excitement associated with feeling threatened, perhaps by dangerous situations, risky behaviors, or associated with exercise. Again, this is a release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla associated with activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So again, the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine as hormones, not as neurotransmitters, but as hormones, is again fight or flight response, preparing the body for physical activity. And so they mobilize fuel sources for cells. They create especially glucose availability through various metabolic processes. They inhibit the release of insulin, so the glucose remains in the body available to muscles for use, same with fatty acids. They also, of course, increase blood pressure, heart rate. They dilate bronchioles in the lungs to increase airflow. Everything that you need to get the body ready for strenuous activity in a fight or flight response. At the same time, they tend to inhibit digestion and urine production, because at that moment during an emergency or exercise, it's not terribly important that you spend much blood or energy doing digestion or urine production. So these are the kinds of effects that we see for epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now again, the adrenal cortex with its 3 zones is very different in terms of the hormones that it releases. The outer zona glomerulosa tends to release a group of hormones known as mineral corticoids. Mineral corticoids work primarily through the kidneys to regulate electrolyte balance, things like sodium, potassium, etc. Probably the best known mineral corticoid that we've talked about already this semester is aldosterone. And remember, aldosterone is a hormone that causes reabsorption of sodium back into the bloodstream. All right, and so again, as is typical of mineral corticoids, it's regulating an electrolyte. Specifically, aldosterone regulates sodium balance. In the zona fasciculata, we see a couple of different kinds of hormones produced: glucocorticoids and androgens. Glucocorticoids, as we'll see in a few minutes, help regulate fuel molecules in the bloodstream. Probably the best known glucocorticoid is cortisone or cortisol. Androgens, of course, are male sex hormones, and so these are testosterone-like hormones that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. And then finally, in the zona reticularis, the deeper layer, once again, we see the secretion of glucocorticoids, again like cortisone, and some sex steroids, again not just male but some female derivatives as well. So again, mineral corticoids, as I mentioned, regulate electrolyte balance, and again the best known one is aldosterone, which specifically regulates sodium balance, and by virtue of regulating sodium balance, it also has an indirect effect on potassium. And you may recall from lecture this term that by reabsorbing sodium, that also tends to drag water with it by solvent drag or osmosis, and so you tend to reabsorb more blood back into the bloodstream, which increases blood volume, which affects blood pressure. And so aldosterone not only affects sodium balance, but also is one of the hormones we use to affect blood pressure. As I said, the glucocorticoids tend to regulate the metabolism of fuel molecules like glucose and fatty acids. Again, the best known one is cortisol and cortisone, corticosterone. These stimulate, again, the breakdown of storage molecules, fat and protein storage molecules, producing glucose and fatty acids that are released into the bloodstream, made available for use by muscle cells. So again, this helps the body adapt to stress by making fuel available to increase metabolic rates, and also important in tissue repair, again by making fuel available. At high levels, cortisol also serves an anti-inflammatory role. And so we know we have various cortisone creams and rubs that we use to help reduce inflammation. But it has to be at pretty high levels in the body, pretty high concentrations to begin serving its anti-inflammatory effect. And then finally we said there were some androgens or sex hormones produced in the adrenal cortex, again in the two zones, the fasciculata and reticularis. The androgens are male-like hormones, testosterone-like hormones. These are important in providing libido, sex drive and libido, especially in women. Of course, in men, testosterone from the testes is most important in that. But during male development, prenatal development, and basically during fetal development, these androgens coming from the adrenal cortex are essentially what drive the embryo/fetus to become male. This is the hormone that determines the ultimate secondary male characteristics, and it's what turns an embryo from its default status of female into male. And then, as we said, there are some female-like hormones, estradiol, for instance, coming from the adrenal cortex. This occurs in very small quantities, but it is important after menopause in women to help sustain bone mass, though, of course, it can't replace the high levels of estrogen coming from the ovaries, and so women do tend to suffer from osteoporosis, even with this estradiol coming from the adrenal cortex. The two parts of the adrenal gland, while separate and producing different hormones, do have some interaction with one another. So, for instance, the adrenal medulla will atrophy if there's no cortisol present. So there's an interplay between the two parts as well. And some of these neuron-like cells of the medulla that release epinephrine, that function like the second or postganglionic sympathetic neurons, some of them will extend up into the cortex and help stimulate the release of corticosteroids. And this, we think, is how we can link emotional stress, which is, of course, harbored in the nervous system, and link that to the secretion of corticosteroids, which might help us in our response to stress. So again, a nerve-endocrine connection. All right, the next organ on our list is the pancreas. We've again looked at the pancreas previously as part of the digestive system. So we're already familiar with its histology. We know that it consists primarily of acinar cells producing digestive enzymes, but embedded within the acinar cells are these usually lighter stained regions called islets of Langerhans, and that, of course, is the endocrine component of the pancreas. Here we see once again the location of the finger-like pancreas, horizontally located essentially beneath the stomach near the top of the abdominal cavity. Another histological view of the islets of Langerhans embedded in the acinar cells. And a very close-up view of the islet of Langerhans. Now, there are different kinds of cells in the islets. There are alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells, but I find them difficult to distinguish, and so clearly we're not going to ask you to distinguish the different cell types in an islet of Langerhans. Just recognize the islet itself. Now again, there are these different cells, and they do produce different hormones. So the alpha cells, for instance, produce a type of hormone called glucagon. Glucagon essentially has the opposite effect of insulin, and so glucagon tends to cause the release of glucose into circulation. And so again, it tends to cause cells to break down stored energy molecules, fat, and glycogen, and release those byproducts as energy molecules available to the cells. So release of glucose, release of fatty acids, and so on. And so it works very much like cortisol and the glucocorticoids in releasing fuel to the tissues. Insulin, of course, has the, as I said, the opposite effect. You usually get a spike of insulin following a meal when blood glucose and amino acid levels are rising. And what insulin does is it tends to cause certain cells to pick up amino acids and glucose from the bloodstream and take them into the cells themselves for either immediate use or for storage. Right? And so cells that can pick it up will either use the glucose and amino acids or store them as glycogen or fat or proteins or so on. So this has a tendency then to lower blood glucose levels and lower amino acid levels in the blood. Now, there are some tissues, some organs in the body, or some cells in the body that can absorb glucose without the help of insulin. And you see those listed here: the brain, the liver, the kidneys, erythrocytes. But all other cells, in order to pick up glucose from the bloodstream, require the presence of insulin. And of course, insulin is notorious because when you don't have enough insulin, you suffer from a condition known again as diabetes mellitus. And so it's difficult for cells to pick up glucose, but more harmful is the fact that glucose levels in the bloodstream remain very high. And these high levels of glucose can damage a variety of tissues in the body, ultimately and eventually causing death if untreated. And it's this high level of glucose, these high levels of blood glucose associated with diabetes mellitus, that cause glucose to wind up in the urine. Under normal circumstances, we should reabsorb 100% of the glucose that's filtered out at the glomerulus. But because there's so much glucose in the blood and so much ends up in the filtrate, we exceed the transport capabilities in the tubules to reabsorb that glucose. We just simply don't have enough carrier molecules to reabsorb all that glucose. So some inevitably ends up in the urine. And that's a classic symptom of diabetes mellitus, is sugar or glucose in the urine. And then there's a third hormone produced by the pancreas, which we don't have on our list of terms, but we should at least acknowledge, and that's somatostatin. And that's secreted by the delta cells. Somatostatin tends to be an inhibitory hormone. It tends to suppress secretion of the other two hormones of the pancreas, and it tends to have an inhibitory effect on other parts of the body as well, especially digestion and absorption of nutrients. So just mention it again, not responsible for it because it's not on our list of terms, but somatostatin is generally an inhibitory hormone produced by the delta cells. So at this point, you want to just stop and pause for a moment and reflect on the number of hormones we've talked about that affect blood glucose and fuel metabolism in the body. We talked about glucagon from the pancreas. Growth hormone certainly does it to promote healing and growth. We said epinephrine and norepinephrine, as part of the sympathetic fight or flight response, will make nutrients available for metabolizing tissues. Cortisol and other glucocorticoids do it, as does corticosterone, which is a version of cortisol. And then, of course, insulin tends to have the opposite effect of storing these energy storage molecules. So quite a few hormones devoted to availability of fuel molecules in the body. The gonads are organs as well, endocrine organs as well, and again, we have some information here on them, but we're not going to talk about them. We're going to pretty much wait until we get to the reproductive system to talk about those. So that pretty much completes our discussion. As I said earlier, I just want to finish up by noting that there are other organs in the body that produce hormones as a part of their function. So the skin, remember, is involved in vitamin D production. The liver produces a variety of hormone-like substances. Again, it's involved in vitamin D. It produces something called angiotensin, involved in blood pressure regulation. produces a portion of the body's erythropoietin, which stimulates red blood cell production. As I said, it's involved in the action of growth hormone, and it's also involved in absorption of iron through hepcidin. The kidneys, of course, play a role. They secrete renin, which is involved in blood pressure regulation. They are involved in the ultimate conversion of calcidiol to calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D. And they produce most of the body's erythropoietin, which again stimulates red blood cell production. The heart produces a hormone that affects sodium reabsorption, very much like mineral corticoids, has the opposite effect of aldosterone and tends to reduce blood pressure by increasing sodium excretion in the urine. And then the stomach and small intestine produce a variety of regulatory hormones that affect the activity of the digestive system. These are things like gastrin, cholecystokinin, secretin, etc. Adipose tissue secretes a chemical known as leptin, which affects hunger. Osteoblasts secrete a hormone that affects pancreas function, and of course the placenta secretes several hormones that regulate and maintain pregnancy. So that's it. And now, because this system is so simple in terms of the anatomy, we are also going to see questions about function on both quizzes and the practical exam. I'll provide more information on that when we get to the point of the next exam, next practical exam. I'll send it out in an email. But my recommendation in terms of studying for a quiz is to take a look at the handout that I have in the CNM Learn site. It's listed under Endocrine Handout. And basically what it is a table of each gland, the hormone that it produces, a very quick summary of the hormone's action. And then for fun, I've included what happens if you have too much of that hormone, not enough of that hormone, and the primary way in which it's regulated. For this class, for the lab, I recommend that you focus on the first three columns: the gland, the hormone produced, and the hormone action. And you'll see every gland that we have listed or on our list of terms is in this table. And you just, again, this is a Word document that you can get from the CNM Learn site. And you really want to focus on those first three columns: the gland, what hormones are produced by each gland, and a basic statement of what the effect is. So it's a very nice summary of everything we've talked about today, and I think it's the best thing to look at as you prepare for next week's quiz. Just going to continue on through the table, letting you see the whole thing. And of course, the last hormone on that list is oxytocin. All right, so that completes our PowerPoint video for the endocrine system. Remember, there is a second short video that will be posted, and it is simply going to show you one of our models from the lab, and it will show you essentially where the major organs are. So I will see you next time. Until then, stay safe.